Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 41, Blockbuster Films Part 1, The Rise of CGI. I haven't talked much about science fiction movies and TV in this podcast because the genre, I feel, is more defined by books. I left off the dedicated discussion of movies and TV in episode 18 with 2001: A Space Odyssey. I've been talking about it off and on since then, especially with Star Trek in episode 25 and Star Wars in episode 32. But the rise of the blockbuster films of the 80s and 90s represented a big enough shift in the genre that it deserves a separate discussion. And I contend that a big part of that was driven by the visual spectacles offered by the new technology of computer-generated imagery, or CGI. CGI may sound like it's just the surface-level trappings of a movie, and to an extent that's right. No special effects will save a truly bad movie. See Thor 2, for example. But CGI is more than just window dressing. It was a new tool in a filmmaker's toolbox. It allows for more dynamic action scenes, more complex settings and choreography and even stunts, richer and more realistic world building. All things that when used well really can contribute to a good story. So I think it is worth seeing how the technology developed and how it contributed to the genre. To start off, we should probably make sure we're on the same page about what a blockbuster is, other than the once successful video rental store that dominated the 90s. And a blockbuster is, well, really just any movie that's big and popular and makes a lot of money. It's not that complicated. The real question is, why do we call it the blockbuster era? Sheldon Hall of Sheffield Hallam University wrote a chapter on the origin of the term blockbuster, link in the description. In it, he examined several possible origins. A blockbuster might have been a movie that was popular enough to earn a special release rather than the pre-1948 practice of selling multiple movies to theaters in blocks. Or it might have been a movie that was so successful that the line for tickets stretched around the block. However, the real meaning appears to be the literal one. The first known use of the phrase was in 1943, the same year that Allied forces began dropping blockbuster bombs, then the largest bombs in their arsenal in World War II. A promo for the 1944 war documentary With the Marines at Tarawa makes the comparison explicit. Quote, "It hits the heart like a 2-ton blockbuster," unquote. A blockbuster film is simply one of the biggest and most powerful films in the industry. The term survived the war and became standard by the 1950s. But whither the blockbuster era? The first modern blockbuster is generally considered to be Jaws in 1975, over 2 decades after the term was standardized. Well, it seems that Jaws was so successful with repeated viewings and word-of-mouth promotion that studios took notice and began to realize that the big-budget, action-packed summer blockbuster could be a lucrative genre in its own right. 2 years later, the unprecedented success of Star Wars cemented this view, and studios began basing their marketing around the blockbusters. And I think that one thing that helped this trend along was the increasing aid of computer-generated special effects. Action movies per se don't necessarily need CGI. The James Bonds, John McClanes, and Jason Bournes of the world don't need much besides exotic locales and a few practical effects of blowing stuff up. But if you want epic, fast-paced action in space, or in a fantasy world, or in a comic book, CGI will definitely give you a leg up. It allowed filmmakers to do things that simply weren't possible before, and that drove the existing concept of the blockbuster to new heights. That's how we got to the blockbuster era, which has been going strong ever since the 70s. But what about CGI? That is, if anything, more complicated. CGI wasn't new technology by the time it got to be really big. Filmmakers have been using computers to assist them in making movies ever since they became widespread enough and powerful enough to be of use. However, the catch, I think, was in how those computers were used. The first film to use CGI is usually quoted as the original Westworld in 1973, in which it simulated a robot's infrared vision using a pixelated heat map. However, computer graphics were even older. The earliest instance of computer graphics I could find in film was Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo in 1958. in which the spirograph-like images in the opening titles were actually drawn by a repurposed anti-aircraft gun's targeting computer. However, that's a borderline case because it was actually an analog computer. It was just some fancy circuitry rather than an actual logic chip. But actually, I consider Westworld itself to be a borderline case too. It did use computer imagery, but it wasn't a set piece or a visual effect on the scenery. It was simulating a robot's infrared vision. It was effectively something that appeared on a computer screen in story, even though it was from the robot's point of view. Wikipedia calls this CGI representing CGI, and it's not quite what we normally think of from the term CGI. The same goes for Westworld's sequel, Future World, the first film to feature 3D CGI on a computer screen. The same for the original Star Wars, which showed the digital stolen Death Star plans on a computer screen. The original Alien, which featured wireframe animations on a computer screen. And Looker, the first film to show a 3D model of a whole human body, which, you guessed it, was still on a computer screen. All of these films were showing futuristic-looking in-story computers. They were showcasing the technology, but not contributing directly to the visual effects. It appears that the first film to use actual CGI special effects for more than a computer rendering was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan in 1982. The Wrath of Khan included one real-life CGI sequence, a computer-generated star field based on the real night sky that the camera could fly through at warp speed. The more famous sequence of the Genesis device being used on a barren planet was, once again, meant to be an in-story computer simulation. And there wasn't a single large shift from Wrath of Khan to modern CGI spectacles. The development of CGI was a slow process of incremental changes over 25 years or so. Khan was followed just a few weeks later by Tron. And yes, Tron was technically inside a computer, but it was still used for computer-generated scenery. And that was only the beginning. In the 80s, graphics artists were gradually expanding what they could do. The ships in The Last Starfighter, the ship in Flight of the Navigator, the owl in Labyrinth, Pixar's Luxo Jr. short film, the water tentacle in The Abyss, and so on. For that matter, TV started to get in on it. Slowly, with its smaller production budgets. Star Trek The Next Generation was using bits of it from its first season for things like the crystalline entity. Each time, the artists pushed a little bit further beyond what could be achieved with practical effects or traditional animation. But despite this incremental progress, the 90s feel different to me somehow. Maybe I'm showing my millennial bias, but just looking at the top box office from the early 90s, it seems like something shifted from the 80s that showed the world just how big a deal CGI could be. Maybe all those incremental improvements finally hit critical mass. Maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree, and I should be talking about anything from Toy Story to Avatar being the point where CGI reached its final form. Maybe it still hasn't. However, I think there are 3 films from the early to mid-90s that really illustrate what a sea change CGI was for science fiction in particular. The first one was Terminator 2. I originally wrote that the T-1000 was the first all-CGI character, but a friend of mine pointed out that young Sherlock Holmes had an all-CGI character with the stained glass knight in 1985, which appears to be the first. Even so, Terminator 2 took it much further and did something that was previously impossible. A character made of flowing, living, liquid metal. Something far more complex than making glass panes walk around. And being made of liquid metal gave him powers that most characters don't have, and would be really hard to film convincingly otherwise. Things like walking through a cell door or slithering through cracks in the ceiling. Things that upped his threat level, basically. So it was important to the story. Granted, The Abyss did something very similar with the water tentacle 2 years earlier. The T-1000 was still an incremental change, but doing a whole character that way opened up a lot of new possibilities. Suddenly, non-human characters weren't limited by humans in suits and practical effects. If you wanted the bad guy to be a giant alien cockroach like in Men in Black, you were good to go, at least as the technology matured. Second, 2 years later, Jurassic Park brought dinosaurs to the big screen in a way no one had imagined before. Now there was not just one CGI character, but many. There were 7 dinosaur species shown in the first film, although I'm not sure if all of them had CGI models. I don't think the Triceratops or Dilophosaurus did. They could and did do a lot of it with physical models and animatronics, but those have significant limitations. Puppets and stop motion are going to be so-so at best at showing a T-Rex chasing after a Jeep in a full body shot. That's what I meant about CGI allowing things to be more dynamic. You can fake being chased by a T-Rex or taking cover from a stampede of Gallimimus with practical effects, but it opens a lot of new possibilities when you can see the animals on the screen in their full virtual glory. And that first scene with the Brachiosaurus. I'm no expert, but I suspect that would have been pretty near impossible with conventional methods. And that scene, while not perfect, still looks pretty good today. Better than some effects made a decade or more later. But it was Independence Day in 1996 that brought massive CGI spectacles to audiences on an unprecedented scale. Sure, films could blow up cities before, and had, but not with the roiling waves of fire blasted out by the ships in Independence Day. Compare The Day After, for example. It had a truly haunting sequence of non-stop nuclear explosions lasting a full 3 minutes. But it was built out of archival footage of nuclear tests, bright flashes, crude animations of mushroom clouds, and even cruder overlays of fire effects. All of which is ironically truer to life if you look at the archival footage, but it doesn't have the same cool factor. Or alternatively, you have the instant firework-like explosions from the original Star Wars, which also don't have that cool factor. Independence Day really showed the world what was possible when CGI went large scale. I should add the caveat that a lot of the destruction scenes in Independence Day were done with miniatures and compositing, but it was still computer-assisted and enhanced. The proper polygons and textures CGI was used more for the aerial battle scenes, which honestly were maybe even more innovative. Star Wars had some cool scenes, but they didn't look that fancy. I've linked a documentary on the making of Independence Day in the description. In any case, Independence Day sparked a renaissance in the genre of disaster movies, where landmarks around the world get gratuitously destroyed. Think Deep Impact and Armageddon, although of the two, Deep Impact is far the superior. Later on, think The Day After Tomorrow, and perhaps the pinnacle of the genre, 2012, which was so over the top that I laughed out loud when I saw it in the theater. I mean, seriously, flying a Cessna below street level through Los Angeles as it collapses into the ocean and dodging a flying subway train. Sheer insanity. But disaster films are only a fraction of what CGI has done just within the genre of science fiction. Not even counting how it's mostly replaced 2D animation by way of Pixar and its competitors. We have new giant monster movies like Pacific Rim and the 2014 Godzilla. Big space battles occur on a scale that was impossible before. See the Star Wars prequels and sequels, and many others. It's opened the way for new and more complex sci-fi on television. See the newer Star Trek series, Stargate, Firefly, the Doctor Who revival, and again, many others. And let's not forget superheroes. We'll get to those later. I do want to give special mention to one movie that came out well after CGI had matured. James Cameron's Avatar. Back in 2009, Avatar was the massive, off-the-charts epic to end all epics. Even now, 12 years later, it is still duking it out with Avengers Endgame for the highest-grossing movie of all time. In fact, it's number 2 inflation-adjusted, after Gone with the Wind. Part of this was probably Cameron's star power. He was beating his own record, and Titanic is still number 3 today. But a lot of it was the immense effort he put into building an alien world that you could simply get lost in. Something so complex and expansive that it was like nothing anyone had ever seen before. It's hard to believe looking back just how big this movie was. I don't remember it like that. The hype around Avengers Endgame is still fresh in my mind. Ditto for number 4 overall, The Force Awakens. But I have to think hard to remember Avatar being like that. I guess it was there. I remember how impressed people were with all the work that was put into the movie. I remember fans claiming they felt depressed after watching it because the world of Pandora was so much more beautiful than reality. It just seems strange to think about it that way today, though. But the main thing is that Avatar really was extremely innovative in terms of world building and CGI. Cameron wrote his first treatment of the script in 1994, when his biggest reference point would have been Jurassic Park. And he had to wait 12 years for the technology to develop to the level he needed to film it. When he finally did, the artists built an alien world with an incredibly lush jungle, floating mountains, trees as tall as mountains, and filled with bioluminescence from all manner of wildlife. Not just a few alien species, but an entire functioning ecosystem, all rendered in IMAX 3D. Cameron consulted with biology professors and speculative biology master Wayne Barlow to design the environment, and he hired linguists to give the Na'vi a full functioning language. As an aside, Avatar was probably the most publicized, serious effort at constructing a fictional language since Klingon. Before Avatar, there weren't many well-known, fully fleshed out and usable fictional languages besides Klingon and Tolkien's Elvish. But Cameron wanted the Na'vi to have a real language and not just alien sounds, so they did. Since then, the trend has become popular in sci-fi and fantasy, with Game of Thrones, Alpha, Defiance, The 100, and more. We'll come back to fictional languages in a future episode. The world building isn't perfect. There are some definite holes in it, mostly centered around how the Na'vi look too human. But it was an incredibly creative world far beyond anything that had been done before. Which honestly makes it rather sad that underneath all the layers of world building and spectacle, the whole thing is held together by a subpar plot. I mean, more than a few people have called it Dances with Wolves in Space, or Pocahontas, or Fern Gully, you name it. It seems strange to say there was so much more potential with something this big, but there was. CGI has continued to develop in the years since Avatar. It seems like it would be hard to top Pandora, but artists constantly do in more subtle ways. Just look at how Pixar pushes itself a little bit further with each new movie. Or Disney's quote-unquote live-action remake of The Lion King. I don't know where CGI is going in science fiction, but I think you can see how it has moved the genre forward and made all manner of new ideas possible. And maybe Avatar 2 will be the one to break new ground. Its release date is starting to look pretty solid. Or maybe it'll be Rendezvous with Rama. That seems like prime territory for an all-CGI environment. Or maybe it'll be more about bringing the latest lessons learned to television. But whatever it is, be sure to remember the long history of the development of CGI technology that led up to that point. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast can be found on all the major podcasting platforms. I'm on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter at Sci Meets Fiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. For my movie recommendation for this episode, I'm going with Jurassic Park. Independence Day is good, but it's over the top and a bit campy. Terminator 2 is also good, but it's a sequel. And we can do better than Avatar. But Jurassic Park, well, there's a reason it's one of the biggest franchises of all time. And in my opinion, none of the sequels have lived up to the original. If you're listening to this podcast and you've somehow never seen Jurassic Park, you should. Now, you may be thinking there's one category of films that I completely skipped over in this episode and only mentioned in passing. Well, that's because it deserves its own episode. It's time to talk superheroes on the next thrilling episode of A Reader's History of Science Fiction. Thanks for listening.